Welcome to episode 90 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. Today I'm interviewing Tyler Hisel, who wrote a horror thriller script called Dark Was the Night. The movie was recently produced, and we talk through his early days in Hollywood as a screenwriter, and then we specifically talk about how he got this project made. So stay tuned for that. This podcast is brought to you by Final Draft, the industry-leading screenwriting software and recipient of a 2013 Primetime Engineering Emmy Award. From inspiration to fade out, Final Draft software helps you every step of the way. Visit finaldraft.com for more information or to download a free trial copy. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube, or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread word about the podcast, so they're very much appreciated. Quick couple of notes. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts, and then just look for episode number 90. I just want to mention, too, a free webinar that I'm doing on Wednesday, September 30th. I'm basically redoing the webinar that I did in August. I had a lot of people who weren't able to attend, so I'm going to do the exact same webinar again, and it's going to be a live event, so I'll be taking questions. People can ask questions. I'll be answering them. The webinar is called How to Effectively Market and Sell Your Screenplay. I'm going through all the various online channels that are available to screenwriters and giving you my opinion of them. I get questions all the time like, does the blacklist work? Does Inktip work? Which contests should I enter? I've tried pretty much every marketing channel available to screenwriters, and I'm going to give you my unfiltered opinion on each one and tell you which ones have worked for me. Again, this webinar is completely free. Don't worry if you can't attend the live event. I'll be recording this event and sending out a recorded version afterwards. So sign up. Even if you can't attend the live event, you will still have access to it. To sign up, go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/free webinar, and the word free webinar is all lowercase and all one word. I will, of course, link to it in the show notes as well. A quick few words about what I'm working on. So as I talked about last week on the podcast, I had a bunch of meetings this past week with producers, actors, and even a distributor in an effort to kind of get my script, my crime action thriller script, moving forward. I think I have all the pieces in place to go out and shoot the teaser trailer and do the Kickstarter video. So this week I'm going to work on getting that all scheduled, hopefully in the next few weeks, and then I'll get the Kickstarter campaign posted. I had a real long and interesting talk with some distributors, and these guys were the international distributors on Ninja Apocalypse, which was a movie that I did a few years ago. And it was interesting just hearing their opinions on what movies seem to be working in the market, and it's really not at all intuitive. One of the movies they've recently distributed is actually a movie that I interviewed the writer on this podcast, and when I saw it, it seemed like a perfectly good movie, but I honestly didn't think it had a lot of international prospects. I didn't think that they would find a good distribution on this thing, and they were very, very positive on it. So it completely baffled me. It completely baffled me in terms of like trying for at least from my standpoint, trying to predict what movies are actually going to work in the marketplace and what aren't. So it's just an interesting conversation. They're very nice guys, and they actually agreed to come on the podcast. So it's not going to be in the next week or two, but hopefully in the next few weeks I'll interview them, and then I will get a podcast episode up with those guys, because it's just fascinating hearing them talk about what is working and what's not working and what movies they want. And it's an ever-changing landscape, and that's one of the things I've had several meetings with them over the last few years, and I always leave really sort of just not really that sure what I should be writing. And frankly, as distributors, they're not entirely sure. There's no slam dunks. And that's one of the things that they kept emphasizing. There's no movies that you can make that you just know are going to make money unless you really get to that sort of top tier where you're talking about like a sci-fi action movie with Bruce Willis. Most of these sort of low budget independent movies, a lot of them don't do well, and some of them do, and there's not always a way of predicting it. So anyways, I think that will be an interesting podcast. Keep an eye out for that. As I said, it'll hopefully be in the next month or so. But the big thing that I worked on last week was a nice writing assignment that came into me. It's actually one of the directors I interviewed on this podcast. I actually emailed. So I interviewed him on the podcast, and he's in my email and fax blast list. And a couple of months ago, I emailed him along with everybody else on my list and said, hey, I'm putting together a newsletter for producers a monthly newsletter for producers to see log lines from the SYS Select screenwriters. And I've talked about this on the podcast as well. So I emailed all my list of producers, and he was actually on the list, and he actually emailed me back, said, hey, good to hear from you. He remembered me from the podcast interview, and he told me he was working on a project, and could I potentially help him with a project that he was working on. I said, sure. So I met with him. He had an idea. I think it's a good idea. He actually still thinks it's a good idea as well. It was an interesting idea, but he just didn't think he could get it done quickly enough, and so we kind of just put it on the back burner. I haven't heard from him in a few weeks, and then last weekend he popped up and called me and said, listen, I'm ready to go into production. He had a bunch of production things in place, but he doesn't have a script, but he's over here and he's putting this thing together. He has an idea, and so he basically wanted me to write a full-length feature film script based on his idea. And when I say his idea, he had about 15 sentences. I would say 3 paragraphs, 15 sentences. He emailed to me, and then he said, hey, do you think you could turn this into a feature film script? And really in less than a week, because he sent it to me over the weekend. We talked last Monday. By the time, we kind of came to an agreement that, okay, yes, I'm going to work on this, it was like Tuesday. And so basically I had, 6 days, I guess really, 6 days to write a feature film script. So that's what I did last week. Needless to say, it was a busy week. It was just pumping this thing out, turning this 15-sentence synopsis into a full-length feature film script. I feel like he's, as I said, he's got a lot of production elements in place, which is kind of why there's this big rush. He's ready to shoot something now. He's got financing. He's got some actors in place. He's got a location. So he wanted to kind of strike while the iron was hot, but he didn't have a script. So that's where I came in. I wrote up this script. It was an interesting experiment, and I've never written a script in 6 days from start to finish. Ninja Apocalypse was a script I wrote very, very quickly, but they had a very detailed outline when I got that assignment. So a lot of it was almost just like transcribing and formatting. There was some creative choices to be made, but it was a different type of assignment, because as I said, they came to me with like a 10 or 12 page treatment that I just fleshed out into a full length script, and I had more time to do it. I had 3 weeks with Ninja Apocalypse. With this, it was literally 15 sentences all the way out to a feature film script. And it was just, as I said, it was an interesting experiment in just forcing yourself to just continue to write and write. And you don't have time to really sit there and, ponder the questions of a lot of the choices you're making. You just don't have time to ponder. You have to kind of just make the choice you can, make the best choice you can, and then go with it. The first day, I spent Tuesday basically just trying to come up with an outline, and I really didn't have by the end of Tuesday, I didn't have a firm outline, but I kind of had the different characters. It's a kind of an ensemble piece, and each character has a nice little arc. So I came up with those 6, I guess maybe 5 characters, and sort of figured out what their arcs were and the beats of their arc. So that was sort of the loose part of the outline. And then, I started writing. So at the end of day Tuesday, I had 7 pages done. I had kind of a very loose outline and 7 pages. Then on Wednesday, I basically wrote another 23 pages. So that got me to 30 pages. Thursday was by far the hardest day. It was an absolutely brutal day. And I don't quite know why, but I wrote 25 pages. So I got from page 30 to 55, and it was rough. I had a PTA meeting at my 5-year-old daughter's kindergarten, and I mean, I just was absolutely beat mentally, and you're just sitting there, so you're not physically tired, but it was just really rough mentally. But anyway, so then Friday though, but as I said, I was on page 55 by the end of day on Thursday, and then Friday I get up and I felt like I was in pretty good shape, and basically I knew most of what I had left to write was sort of the third act, page 55 to about 70-ish, 75-ish. I knew that third act would get me to where I would have a rough draft of the script with the next page 55 to page 75-ish. I knew I would get a rough draft of the script, and that's pretty much what I did. And writing that third act, as I said, Friday was a very easy day. I ended up writing 25 pages, but it was a very easy day, and I think all those choices had been made, and maybe that's part of what is mentally fatiguing, is making those choices, whereas on Friday I wasn't making the choices as much as just paying off the choices that I had made. And so it was just literally just a function of forcing myself to just sit at the keyboard and constantly just type out words and get to the end of it. So that's what I did. I got to page 55, 65, 75. So I got to page 80 by the end of the day on Friday, and I had a full rough draft, and I'd actually gone back and started to polish up, let's say, the first 30 pages. So I got through those last, as I said, my rough draft was about 75 pages. So I went from 55 to 75, about 20 pages. Then I started back at the front of the script, continued to write, got through the first act on Friday, rewriting and polishing the first act, and then over the weekend I continued to polish the rest of it, and then read through it yesterday and did a final polish yesterday on Sunday. And the script is 86 pages. I mean, the thing that's amazing, and I'm going to be curious to see how the director takes it. I might present some of it to my writers group, be interested to see how they get it, is like, I don't think it's that bad. I actually think it's pretty good. And the one thing I'll say about it is the concept, the idea that he had, it's a drama. And one of the things that I find always fairly difficult with like a thriller, you have to really sit there and think about sort of the clues and the thriller, you know, the thrills and the surprise and the mystery of it. And those things, at least for me, take quite a bit of time. Whereas just straight drama, you know, character arcs, it's more about plotting. You know, you set up the characters, it just seems like an easier process than, as I said, something. I find action is fairly easy. Ninja Apocalypse was pretty much an action movie, a lot of fighting, and I find that pretty straightforward. And just it's a function more of just writing. So I don't know. As I said on Thursday, I thought, man, I can never do this again. But by Friday, I thought, gee, this really wasn't so bad. And I've never done a full script in 6 days, so I don't know. If it's a function of just getting through those first couple pages is rough, and then you're pretty much into smooth sailing, because that's really what it was. It was 2 really tough days. Wednesday and especially Thursday were tough, but then Tuesday wasn't that bad because it wasn't that much writing. It was mostly just, you know, pacing around my house writing on a pad and plotting it out. And then once I had that rough draft, as I said, this past weekend, Saturday and Sunday, was just a matter of going through and rewriting, tweaking, and polishing. And those were not terribly hard days either. So I don't know. Could I keep that up? Could I keep pumping out a script a week? You know, 50 scripts a year. That seems like a tall order, but wasn't that bad. So I would probably try it again. And I almost have half a mind just to spend maybe a month doing an outline, just leisurely do an outline, and then just spend a week just ripping the whole script out, because you really get a lot done. And as I said, I'm going to be curious to see how people take this, but my guess is people will think this is just as good as anything else I've written, even though I wrote it in 6 days, as opposed to some of the other scripts where maybe I've spent 6 months on. I bet a lot of people will think this is better, or some people will think it's as good or whatever. So anyways, that's what I'm working on. I'm waiting for the director. I literally sent it to him late last night. I'm recording this early on Monday morning, so I haven't heard from him. Hopefully I'll hear from him soon. And I'm hoping he doesn't have a lot of changes. The way he was talking, he's got to go into production pretty quickly, so I don't think he's going to have a ton of time to make a lot of revisions. Hopefully he'll like it and he'll be ready to move on it, and we'll get into production. As I said, from talking to him, it sounded like he was pretty serious about actually getting this thing into production quickly. So hopefully that will happen. Anyway, so now let's get into the main segment. Today I'm interviewing Tyler Hisel. Here is the interview. Welcome, Tyler, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
I appreciate you having me.
So to start out, maybe you can just give us a little bit about your background. You know, how did you get interested in filmmaking? How did you eventually break in and get to the point where you wrote this feature film?
Sure, absolutely. I'm originally from Lexington, Kentucky. So I'm a Midwest guy. And I was a guy who just, I think, like a lot of us working in the industry, grew up obviously loving movies, loving television, and grew up, as a kid just making movies, on mini DV and any camera I could get my hands on growing up in middle school and high school. And I think as a lot of people initially do, that I wanted to direct. I thought that was my path. And then I was making these movies, I was directing these movies, and I was writing out of necessity. You got to have something to shoot when you're out making films. And so I got into college, pursuing that at a university, a small private university back here in Kentucky on that path. And part of that degree was a semester in Los Angeles, right? It's at a program called the Los Angeles Film Studies Center, which is kind of like a semester abroad for a lot of these Midwest schools who can't necessarily do their own film program, but they all kind of funnel into this one place. And part of that was an internship. And so when I moved out to LA, I knew that semester when I came out to LA for that semester abroad type of thing. That was going to be my transition period. I mean, I knew I wanted to move to LA. I knew I wanted to take a run at it. And so I came out with a script in my back pocket, you know, that in the months preceding that semester, I knew enough to know, you know, that I didn't want to start at zero, that I wanted to have, I mean, I'd written stuff in the past, but I wanted something that I felt comfortable was of the quality that could get my career started. And so I wrote a script that was at the time called The Trees, which is, I think we'll talk about a little bit here in a bit, has ultimately become Dark Was the Night. After, you know, many years and many ups and downs, we've finally gotten to the promised land here. But I had that in my back pocket, and so I moved to LA. I got an internship at a company called Copelson Entertainment for Ann and Arnold Copelson. They did, you know, The Fugitive and Seven and Platoon, and I interned for them, graduated, you know, moved the wife out here with the Honda Civic right after college, and you know, I think as you know, everyone does, you just do the hustle. You know, you'd find a way to stop hemorrhaging money, because LA is obviously a very expensive place, and so my first job, you know, I needed a job. Like when I was graduating, I was like, before the semester's over, I need a job because I'm going to be back in 3 weeks and I got to have some form of income. And so my first job in LA was loading people onto the Simpsons ride at Universal Studios, right? So
that was my first job, was at Universal as well. I was in show control, actually.
Nice.
Ushering the people. Back then it was the Flintstones show.
Very nice, man. Well, you probably that sounds like it has a lot more dignity than what I was doing. I had like, I don't know if you've been recently.
It did. I was telling Japanese tourists they weren't allowed to sit in the handicapped spots, and they spoke no English.
That's great. I don't know if you've been recently and you've seen The Simpsons, right? It's like we're Back to the Future. They have these terrible candy stripe, like red and white clown outfit. It's the worst. And so, well, yeah, we have this commonality. It's an exclusive club we're in. But yeah, so I mean, I was doing that, and then, you know, I could, from Universal, you could see the lot, you know, like I was like, okay, I can at least see the place that I, you know, the business that I want to work in. And shortly thereafter, I started doing background acting. It was an extra, you know. I think I just figured out, how can I get on sets, you know, how can I just soak all of this stuff up while I'm writing at night, you know, just how can I do that? And so I started, you know, went down to Central Casting, and I did that thing, and you know, what that allowed me to do was, one, just be on sets and just kind of observe, and two, I did something that you're probably not supposed to do, which is I'd find the second AD on every show I went to, and I just hand them a resume, and I say, look, you know, I'm a hard worker, I'm eager to do whatever. If you guys need an extra PA, you know, keep me in mind. And finally, that started happening, and so then I was working, you know, in the industry, and again, writing at night, again on the same script. You know, I was polishing this script called The Trees at the time, and finally I got a phone call from the assistant that I had worked under as an intern at Copelson Entertainment, who was leaving the desk, and was calling to see if he could put me up for the gig. And I said, yeah, absolutely. You know, 9 to 5, 9 to 7, whatever the hours would be, but a regular paycheck, and at a desk and not out in the heat. And sure, you know, development, that's closer to what I wanted to do anyway as a writer. And so I started there and worked at Copelson Entertainment for a couple of years on a desk. And it was during that time that just one kind of these weird happenstance things. We had just moved offices from Century City up to Sherman Oaks, and our phone numbers had changed. And so I got an email one day from a literary manager, a guy by the name of Alexander Robb, who was looking for a new phone number. And again, one of those things you're not supposed to do. But I said, hey, you know, I gave it to him. I said, hey, yeah, I got a little. After we went back and forth a bit, I said, I'm a writer. I see you're a literary manager. If you're ever looking for anything, here's a spec I just finished called The Trees. And a couple weeks went by, and he shot me back an email and said, hey, you know, I'd love to grab coffee and talk about the script. And from that, and I can talk a little bit, I was working on some other stuff at the time, a TV pilot at the time. But from those conversations, from The Trees and from that pilot, he brought me on. He started representing me, and Alex is still my manager today. And so that was kind of like the first moment of like, okay, now I've got my feet under me to a degree, and from there, a lot has happened since, obviously, but that was kind of how do you get from zero to at least like you can see the door. Maybe you're not in the door yet, but you can at least see the door.
And let's touch on a couple more details of what you just said. How many years was this? Okay, so you've graduated college, you've moved to LA, and you finally get a literary manager. How many years went through before you got that literary manager?
From when I landed in LA, I mean, I was fairly fortunate. Things happened quick because it was off of that first script. So I had a manager. I found my manager within, I'd say, a year of being in LA full time. And so, again, it was all based on that same script. You hear this axiom a lot of like, well, you don't want to revise too much, and that's true. You don't want to just keep going back to the same material over and over again if there's not a lot of life in it. But I had kind of held that script back, the trees, until I knew it was ready. So it wasn't something that I was constantly, trying to make happen that wasn't going to happen. I just waited until it took me a couple of years before I felt like I know this script is good enough. And so at that point, I started having conversations, and so very quickly thereafter, that relationship came about.
Yeah. And let's talk about these movies. It almost sounds like you were doing these original sort of short home movies before you were even in college. So, yeah. I mean, maybe you can describe that a little bit. I mean, it's just like basically a camcorder and friends acting and writing. Maybe you can talk about sort of some of the lessons, the logistics of doing that and the lessons you learned from that experience.
Sure. Yeah. No, I have a catalog of these films that, a lot of them were just short genre pieces, short thrillers. My family back in Kentucky had this old farmhouse out in the, this farmland that's near where they grew up. My father grew up in this house, and it's since has fallen into this terrible disrepair. So it was this fantastic, creepy looking farmhouse. And so like you have things like that where you're like, okay, let's just make a movie about that, and let's put two guys, who I go to high school with. Let's just put them in a movie. Let's put them in a situation. And so it was a lot of that, that movie was called Static, and it had like some TV with static on it or something. I don't know, but it was fun, and it was like we were making movies, and it's like we got into some like tiny festival in New York, and it was like, oh, this is, we're getting closer. This feels like, something that's real. And through that, I mean, again, like I said, writing was out of necessity at that time. And so it's exactly what you're talking about. What you learn is like, okay, let's learn the logistics of like, I can put this on a page, but how am I going to execute this? And oh no, our location fell through, and now it's suddenly you're a writer in production, and I got to have new pages before the weekend because we're going to be shooting, and so you learn a lot, I think, additionally from just hearing your words, seeing them performed and hearing them said aloud, that's something that I think every writer should strive for, whether it's in a short film or whether it's in, you've got a writer's group or you've got some way of just kind of round tabling stuff. You learn a lot from just hearing words spoken aloud, things you think work may not work, things you weren't sure about. You go, oh no, actually that works. Let's lean into that a little bit more.
So literally though, you're in high school shooting these things, and who were you getting as actors? Just other high school kids? You got a couple adults to come in and do little roles?
Right. Mostly it was friends, but then I suddenly realized like there was, I think you'll see in a lot of Midwest towns is like there are people who want to act, and it's hard, people who work as insurance agents or whatever who want to act on the weekends. And so I finally I found some online casting service or something like that, and I'd start putting roles up there, and suddenly, hey, I've got these guys who, I don't have to age up 20 years to play a 40-year-old. I can have a 40-year-old. And so I mean that, like, initially it was like, okay, me and my buddy, and then in the basement we'll do something, and then eventually you're like, okay, no, like this is kind of like the realest thing going on in this town, and people will actually work for you and for the opportunity to make movies.
Yeah. And you're literally 17 years old, and you're directing these 40-year-olds in these low budget films.
Yeah. And it's,
and I think that's so good to hear, because I get so many emails from younger people. Hey, what can I do to get started? And I mean, this is just exactly like, if you're 17 and you want to be a filmmaker, this is exactly what you should be doing. Right. So this is great information. So then talk about a little bit about, you started to get into some festivals. festivals. How many festivals were you submitting to, and did that actually work into anything? Did you make some contacts? How did that kind of go?
I mean, not really. I threw a lot of good money away, because you're like, I'm going to get into Palm Springs. No, you're not. It's you figure out, that it's necessary to kind of calibrate. I think that's at any stage in your career to go, here's where I think I am, but where am I actually? Let's put some feelers out and go, okay, no, I'm not quite there, or maybe I'm I do a little bit better than I thought it was, So like they ran the gamut, of festivals, and the stuff that we would ultimately get into was, like some showcase, non-competitive showcase in Manhattan or something like that. But again, you're in high school, you're a freshman in college or whatever. That's a big deal. Hey, I'm going to go to New York and I'm going to watch my movie on a screen, and that's important fuel, I think, because like that's the stuff that you go, I want more of that. I want more of audiences sitting in a room and watching my stuff. That's what we do it for.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dig into Dark Was the Night. Maybe you can start to talk about that. On IMDb, you have another credit listed, Safari, which you also wrote. That looks like another genre film. So maybe you can take us through sort of whatever your first option or sale. You're to the point where you have a literary manager. After you got the literary manager, sort of walk us through your career and what's going on and what you're doing.
Sure. So like I had the script in that I was talking about, The Trees, which would later become Dark Was the Night, who had kind of cemented that relationship with a literary manager. And at the same time, I'd been working with a buddy of mine on a project, a pilot. Again, it was a spec pilot. And that's, again, one of those things. It's like, what are you doing writing a spec pilot? We had a relationship with a producer at Warner. He was kind of interning for this guy at Warner, and there was like, okay, maybe there's an opportunity this guy would come on. He would at least read, I could get this read by somebody who's legit and at a studio with a deal. And so, while I had kind of finished up The Trees and just started shopping it out, I had started writing on this pilot, that was at the time called The Brink. Nothing to do with the HBO show now, but it was something that was this hostage standoff on this naval destroyer under construction in San Diego, and it was this conspiratorial thing. And I knew, specking a pilot, people are going to go, who's this kid? No thanks. So I put like a 26-page Bible together alongside that show that was like, look, here's every episode of this first season. You don't have to trust me. It's all on the page. And so I had that as well. I was just wrapping up on that when I'd had these initial conversations with my soon-to-be manager. And so he had liked the script, The Trees, and, was interested in the property. And then when I had this other property that I just finished up, this pilot that he dug as well, it was suddenly like, okay, now this is a full-fledged, representation situation. The guy can do more than one decent script. And so a relationship kind of came out of that. And so we did several months of development, he and I, just back and forth on The Trees, getting it to where, we thought it needed to be. And then it went out. In 2009, it went out. And it got, a little bit of interest here or there. And, it was one of these things where we had some people on and like, oh, we're going to make the movie. And then it just doesn't happen after a while. And then a couple months after that, I think it's December, when the list comes out, the script landed on the 2009 blacklist. And, I can't say enough, especially for the list at that time, about what that list did and does for young writers. The annual list. I know they've got the website and all that stuff now, but the annual list just gives such legitimacy to a young writer at that point in my career, where you're constantly, even though I have a literary manager, where you're constantly, everything's outgoing. You're knocking on doors. You're the one making the calls. Please take a meeting. Please, please read this thing. And suddenly that changes the conversation, and those doors are open, and the calls are coming the other way of, hey, we read the script. I was a blacklist writer. Yeah, we'll take the meeting. And so, that was a conversation changer, as far as, and still to this day, if you see anything, any article or anything like that, it'll say blacklist writer. And I think, I love that. And hopefully that's what it always says.
Maybe you can explain the process a little bit of how the script ended up on the blacklist. I mean, I understand your manager is doing a good job just to get the script out there, but is there anything that he did that was special that kind of got it in the conversation I mean, did he just have enough pull with the producers that, vote on the blacklist? Sort of, what's that process like?
I mean, my understanding of it is, the script goes out probably a month or two before the blacklist voting started. And so a lot of these meetings that I was taking were right around the time people were voting on the list. And for those who don't know, like the blacklist, I think they still do it this way, but they'll send out emails to a roster of Hollywood executives that they have, and they'll say, hey, voting's open for the annual blacklist. Give us your top, up to 10 favorite scripts of the past year that haven't been made yet, unproduced scripts. And so they'll fire back. At the time, it was like an email. I think now there's like a web form, or I'm sure they've got the website. They've got it all figured out. And so I was having conversations. I mean, this was a movie, that I, for years, and especially I started at this time, jokingly kind of pitching as a family drama that happens to be a creature film. It's a movie that doesn't fit a lot of boxes. And so when you look at blacklist scripts, a lot of it is that, like, oh, this is a project that, people like, but how do you make it? Like, how do you finance this thing that is like, oh, it's a creature film, but it's not, it's more about this guy and his family, and you're like, like, how do you market that? And so it was a script that, was quirky enough that it had a lot of fans. And so when that list comes around, most people's favorite scripts, a lot of them get made very quickly, but the blacklist kind of becomes this catch-all of these quirky scripts that don't fit the boxes, very tightly, but people like and would love to have been on in some way. They just, it doesn't fit their mandate or whatever. And so, you hear all these, accusations of campaigning and all that stuff for the blacklist. At that point, we didn't even have the means to do that. It was just like, hey, we're just trying to get it read. Campaigning was just this, that's something that's so far out of our reach at that point. But yeah, it just happened, and it was a crazy thing. I think the day before the list comes out, my manager got an email from someone in Franklin Leonard's office. He runs the blacklist. I think he was still at Universal at the time, and they were just confirming all the information on the script, and we were like, what? Does that mean it's on the list? Because the list comes out tomorrow. And so, like, that morning I was refreshing Deadline, to see if it hit, and it did. And so it was a big moment for sure.
Yeah. So that's great. Okay, so then take us through. So now you've made the blacklist. You've started to get out and have meetings. What was sort of the next step to actually optioning and then selling your first property?
Yeah, well, that script had, I mean, again, like, it had bounced around for years. I mean, that was 2009. We're in 2015 right now. Like, that's the script that got a lot of attention first. But the first thing I actually sold was that pilot I was talking about a little bit earlier, the Brink. And so, like, we had a lot of conversations about the trees. Soon to be dark was the night with various producers, and we had I'd done some work here or there with this studio or that studio, and a lot of those conversations were addressing what I was talking about a little bit earlier. Like, okay, this studio's interested, but they want it to be more of a down-the-middle, monster movie. They want it to just be more marketable. And so it's a fine line to walk, and sometimes you have, as a writer, you have to go, look, what we're talking about here is a fine movie. I'm happy to write you that movie, but it may not be this movie, And so that's something that I think every writer, it's hard when you think, okay, there's money on the table here. This could, this is something that I wanted, but sometimes you have to go, you know what, I don't think this will be the strongest version of this movie, so maybe we go elsewhere with it. And so for a while, that seemed like that may have been a very bad decision because it floated around for quite a while, and ultimately, independent equity, was the conversation. Like, let's do this independently. This is a scalable movie. It was written, as a movie that could have been done for $50 million. But what's it look like at 10? Let's start having conversations about that. What's it look like at 5? Let's start having conversations with people who could do that. And I had, in the meantime, while all of this was going on, I had initially had an agent, and then switched agencies to my current agent, Katie Cates, who was at the time with Kaplan Staller, and she had read my pilot, The Brink, and was just very high on it, and signed me because of that. And within 6 weeks, she had sold that to Sony Pictures TV, and so that was actually my first sale. Despite the kind of hoopla around the trees, that took a lot longer. And since then, I've sold other stuff, and other stuff has come out. We mentioned Safari. We can talk about a little bit. But yeah, this has just been one of these long, like much like the movie is a slow burn. The path of Dark Was the Night has been a very slow burn.
Yeah. So now tell me, with this pilot, did they go and shoot the pilot episode? What ended up happening with that once you sold it?
When it was sent out to networks, we got very close at a particular network, to the point where I was flying, to meet high-ups in different parts of the country. It looked like it was going to happen, but mandates change, and that's what happened. So that script ultimately did not go to pilot, but it established me. Like the business, I think writers, especially now, need to have the ability to go back and forth between film and TV. I mean, TV, if you look at the WGA job report that just came out last week, the work in TV, the money in TV is there, and it's a little bit harder to get those mid-budget adult dramas that I kind of my bread and butter done in the feature space. And so I've been kind of, you need to kind of live in both worlds, and that script for me established me in the TV space. A lot of producers live in both worlds, but a lot don't. A lot of those executives, you're talking to network executives, they haven't read your feature spec, they don't read the blacklist scripts, so you need to kind of keep, both plates spinning. And so that script was great to, even though it didn't go, yet, still might, it established me as an entity in those people's minds. So now I can pitch to them. Now that I can bring them my next spec, they may actually read it a little bit faster, and, I know him, I like that script, it just didn't work out, or whatever.
Okay. So let's dig in a little bit more to Dark Was the Night. Maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of where that idea came from and just the genesis of the story.
Sure. Yeah, I kind of grew up as a bit of a nerd for all of this, like, UFOs and Bigfoot and the Jersey Devil, and I grew up on the X-Files, and that was the show, and I was in that where I was a nerdy kid, and still am a nerdy guy who's fascinated by that stuff. And I was familiar with this true story out of the 1800s in this little town in England called Topsham, England. And there's this story you can look up. You can see the newspaper articles today called The Devil's Footprints. And it was this small, sleepy little community that woke up one morning to freshly fallen snow and biped hoof prints going all throughout their community and throughout the countryside. And you could see these articles about how terrified people were. This is the devil. What does this mean? Or, and the idea from that was, what does that look like? What if that exact same thing happened instead of in England in the 1800s in modern day America in a rural community? I don't think the reaction would be all that different. And so that was kind of the launching off point of that, and let's take pieces of American folklore, let's build this out and go, look at all these stories across thousands of years, across thousands of miles, these pieces of folklore of what roams in the woods. What if there's a kernel at the very center of all of that of truth that is the commonality of this, let's take the Wendigo legend, let's take the Jersey Devil, let's take these Yeti legends and say, what would the real thing at the center of all of that potentially look like? And so from that, there was this kind of new piece of folklore that I sought to create in the structure of this kind of inciting incident, if you will, of these hoof prints of this community realizing that they're about to confront something unlike anything they've seen, and it's only going to get worse.
Now, I'm curious, and you've kind of mentioned this a couple of times just about in the marketing of this script and trying to figure out sort of what it is. How aware were you? Obviously you were young and sort of new in the industry when you came up with this idea, but how aware were you that this didn't fit easily into a sort of a box of a typical creature feature horror movie? Was it just not a consideration? You just wanted to write the script you wanted to write?
Yeah. I mean, and I think that what you said at the end is right. I mean, I was a guy, who had nothing to lose when I was writing the script, and I didn't, and I think too often young writers chase, and I think too often established writers chase. You start taking meetings and you go, oh, this is what people are looking for. Let me write. Let me, shoehorn my thinking into that box. And my advice always to young writers is don't chase. If you're going to miss interesting. People respect interesting. A mediocre down the middle script gets no one's attention. And so I was kind of aware of it, but at the time, I love that feature, the creature stuff. I was talking about this folklore. I love that, but at the core of it, I wanted this to be a character piece. What's the most interesting man to kind of face off against this threat emerging from the woods? And I grew up, when I wrote the first draft of this was, in my parents' basement in Kentucky. I grew up with people, from middle America and these rural communities. I know these people, the people in this movie are people that I grew up with. There's a lot of me in a lot of these people. And so I just wanted to tell a story that was genuine, I didn't want to, I didn't care like, oh, this is how you write a creature feature. Let's just write the best movie. For me, I had nothing to lose. If it was no good, it was no good. And so that was the idea of like, let's take this guy and make it a character study about a man going through loss. We've got this character of Paul Shields, who at the beginning of our movie is suffering through the loss of his son, who died about 8 months ago. And Paul very much blames himself. He was the one who he feels responsible. He's this small town sheriff who's supposed to be a protector, and he can't even protect his own son, right? And so we introduce this idea, this threat from the woods, and suddenly everyone in his community is looking at him to be the protector, and he doesn't see himself as that guy anymore. And so he has to kind of reconcile that, and like he has to, he can't keep pushing away his problems. He's got to come to terms with what happened and who he is, if he's going to stand any chance of saving, the people that he loves and the people that trust him to protect them.
Yeah. So let's dig into sort of the logistics of actually getting this thing sold. So you've taken the script around to studios. They like it, but can't quite get a grasp on what it is. So now you're having conversations. Well, maybe what could it look like at $5 million or probably even less? So who are you having those conversations with, and what does that, like, what were those meetings? What did you actually start to do to push this more in like the independent route, which it ended up being?
Sure. Yeah. Initially, when you're doing something like that, thankfully I wasn't doing free drafts or anything for those producers. The script came under option at a handful of companies that were pulling together independent equity. And so the conversation was like, okay, if this deal comes about, and they commission me for a draft, what does that look like? Because at that time, right around that time, I had just become WGA off of the TV show. So, that conversation becomes different. It's like you can't just, work for free for there are parameters in which you sign off where you say, I've got to do, I need their minimums and all this stuff. But you can have those conversations. What does the movie look like at the price you guys are able to do it at? And so we started, figuring that out, and I had outlines of like, okay, we can scale this. How do we protect what's central and what's important, the soul of the movie, while, maybe we don't need this huge scene in a blizzard that lasts 15 minutes outside at night, like all of that stuff. You go, maybe we could kind of, contain this a little bit more and maintain what's important. And so, I had it under option at a company that was trying to make the movie, and then I got a phone call from Jack Heller, who is one of the principals at Caliber Media, who called up and said, look, I found the script on the blacklist. This wasn't a submission. This was just, years later on the blacklist. He was scouring the list. He had his assistants looking for material that had never really, gotten traction off of the list, and he came across this script. He said it was the first one he read, and he decided that he wanted to make the movie, and so he started calling me. But at the time, it was under option with this other company, and I was in this place of like, do I renew with these guys that I was with, or do I trust Jack to follow through on the fact that he was calling me and said, we're going to make this movie in 6 months. You give me the script, the movie's done, we're making the movie in 6 months, which, you get used to, you hear stuff like that a lot. And so you just kind of build a healthy skepticism. But when it became available, I said, okay, I told Jack, let's do it. And so I let them acquire the script, and he was right on the money. Within 6 months, we were in production on Dark Was the Night.
And did he have some sort of at this point you had already trimmed it down, did he have some sort of rough budget range that you were looking at?
Yeah, I mean, like when you're talking about independent equity, obviously every penny counts. This wasn't the $25 million version, and so the conversations. I mean, even before we formalized the script, in our relationship, those were the conversations. Like, that's the vetting, because again, I've been through this for years of like, let's make sure we see the movie the same way, just so that we don't, no one gets frustrated about, oh no, I thought it was this and I thought it was this. And Jack got it from the very beginning. The conversations were, how can we do these? How can we scale this to the size that makes sense independently, but protect what's really important? And from the beginning, Jack got the idea, this idea that it's a family drama that happens to be a creature film. Like I said, like he got it. And so from there, we were, very much just kind of going back and forth. And I was there, fortunately, on every step of the process. When changes needed to happen, I was there to facilitate them and to kind of have that as a conversation. All too often, you hate to hear like a writer, sells the script and they get bumped off the script. It happens all the time. But fortunately, I was there to kind of usher these changes that, that needed to happen, and we could figure out the best way to execute them while protecting what we both thought was the heart and soul of the movie.
Yeah, for sure. I want to touch on one thing. It's a common thing I talk to screenwriters about, and I just want to get your take on it. You mentioned like when you first got your manager, there was about 6 months of development. You've mentioned you optioned the script a bunch of times and went through development. People and the development executives were saying, well, let's make it more of a straight up horror, creature feature horror movie. And you were saying, well, I don't know if it's this movie. How do you get through those meetings and get through those, rewrites? In some cases, it sounds like they're paying you to do the rewrite. But even with the manager, I've been in these situations where the manager, you get in this endless cycle of rewrites, and it gets very, very demoralizing. You just feel like it's never going to end, and you get to the point where you feel like the notes they're giving you are completely ridiculous, or they're not going to make the script better. How do you handle that, and how do you get through those projects and just persevere through that? I think the one thing I think is really I want to emphasize is that when people go into screenwriting, they don't realize like that's like 90% of screenwriting,
right.
And they think it's going to be like 90% sitting at their desk writing up these fanciful ideas, and it's not. It's 90% grinding out half-baked ideas from development executives that may or may not know what the hell they're talking about, and it just can be demoralizing. And I think people really need to understand, that's a big part of the job, and how can you get through it? Right.
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's very important. Like I was talking about that conversation that I had with Jack, the director of Dark Was the Night, up front, was let's make sure before we go down this path that we both see the same movie. I can't overstate the importance of that. And so that first initial coffee that I had with my soon-to-be manager when he dug the script was, okay, if we're going to go down this path and if we're going to develop this script together, let's make sure we're both running toward the same end zone. Because otherwise you get exactly what you're talking about. Of like you start getting notes, you're like, what is it? I don't know what you're steering us into this ravine. I don't know why. We're clearly trying to go this way. And so I think the importance, whether it's with a manager or whether it's with a development executive, is before and it's a hard conversation to have, especially when you get somebody through the door who's like, you're the first person who has validated what I want, which is to say I can write, and so sometimes people just latch on to whether it be a producer or whether it be a representative. I think you just need to take a beat and make sure that the relationship will work by making sure you're both striving. And whether it's a script or whether it's your career, when you're signing with a new rep, be very clear about this is where I want to be. This is what I want to do. This is where I want to see myself in 5 years. Do you see me as that type of writer, or are you going to try to turn me to something else? So I guess that's my answer, because yeah, once you get into down the path and into a relationship, sometimes that can be very frustrating, and it happens. I mean, it happens all the time when you get into a relationship with an exec, and it's just you're not seeing it the right way, you're not seeing it the same way, and maybe it doesn't work out. But hopefully you can kind of get ahead of that a bit if you have that upfront conversation about what is.
Have you been in some of those situations where? And it's especially, I totally agree with what you're saying, but it becomes especially difficult, as you say, if you're like a new writer, this is the first manager, and he's telling you, well, no, we should go this way, even though you want to go that way. It's hard to say no to that because you don't have a lot of other options. But have you been in situations with managers and producers where you just you knew it wasn't a good fit and you just had to turn them down and walk away from it, even though you thought, gee, maybe I should have done this?
Sure. I mean, hopefully it isn't such a big issue. Like, I mean, all the time, you get notes all the time. And hopefully, for example, with I just had another TV property that sold, and we went through several drafts. And again, these are paid things, so you want to honor, the notes that come in for sure, because they're paying you to do your job. And so hopefully what happens, however, is that, again, you've had those upfront conversations. This is what the show is. This is what the movie is. And when those notes come in, this isn't always the case, you can't control this, but hopefully there's a trust there that, a lot of times when notes come in, a good exec will, if they're paying you to do the work, will trust will trust your judgment. That's your job. That's what you're doing. So if you can say, look, I know this is a note that's come down it may come down from the top of the studio, whoever, but here's my concerns about it. And a good executive, will listen to it and go, you know what, if you don't think that will work, or if you think this will pull too many, this thread kind of damages it too much, then maybe we don't do that. We'll trust you to fix the problem. A lot of times, a bad note is, we want you to do this. A good note is, here's what we're bumping up against. Maybe it's fixed this way, but it's up to you to kind of figure it out. And so, sometimes when people get stuck, they get pitched, they get a note that's a fix, but they haven't been told what the problem is, because your elbow hurts, but is it the bone? Is it the tendon? Like, that's up to the writer to figure out. Just tell me your elbow hurts and I'll take a look at why.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so how can people see Dark Was the Night? Do you have the release schedule? When is it going to be in theaters? When is it going to hit video on demand and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. It comes out July 24th, Friday, July 24th on iTunes, Amazon, and in select theaters. I think we're in LA, New York, Orlando, Kansas City, Dallas, and Lexington, Kentucky, my hometown, which is where I'm at right now. That's why I'm back home. Nice. To do some local press and to just kind of soak it up here and prove to my parents it's a legitimate job.
Yeah. So I just want to touch on one last thing before we leave, and we talked about this in the pre-interview a little bit. I get a lot of writers sending me the question, do I have to move to LA to be a successful screenwriter? I think your story is a good one. Maybe you can talk a little bit about living in Kentucky and also living in LA and the back and forth, and do you think you could have gotten your career going if you'd have never moved to Los Angeles?
I mean, it's a very good question, and it is a question, as you would imagine, I hear a lot too, when people who know that I have a place back in Kentucky as well as LA. I think, if you really want to get into this business and this career, you have to come to terms with spending some full-time portion of your life in Los Angeles early in your career. I mean, is it possible to hit the lottery from Iowa, to get the right guy to answer the right email, to read the script, and they send you a check and suddenly you're a millionaire? It's possible, but that's not the game you want to play with your career. I don't think. If you're very serious about it, you want to say, how do I get the highest probability of success? And when you're young, hopefully, if you're just out of school, or you've opted to do this instead of going to college, like, that's the time in your life to take big swings, to figure out whether it's for you. I think you need to come to terms with spending some time in LA if you're young. But that said, there's so many more outlets than there were when I started. And with, like, we're talking about the blacklist and all these resources, it's possible to get your material out there, more than it was in the past. But even if you get traction on a script, you're gonna, the question's gonna be, how do you capitalize on that? If I'd hit the blacklist in '09, but I wasn't in LA, it wouldn't have done me much good, because like what I was saying is like you then are in those rooms. You're then suddenly the guy that people met. And, oh yeah, I remember meeting with him after that, reading that script I liked. He was a decent guy. Maybe this idea is right for him. And so much of this town is just in this business is those relationships. People who will bring you concepts or ideas, or more than that, people who will remember you and read your script next time. And in TV, particularly, if you're going to work in TV, it's a must to at least be full-time in LA for, a portion of the year if your show goes. So my situation is I've got a residence in LA and a residence in Kentucky, and I've got I just kind of ping pong back and forth pretty regularly. I've got a little 2-year-old who we try to keep with the grandparents as much as possible, but when I need to be in LA, you just build that into your lifestyle. I live on planes a lot, but that's the price to pay.
Mm-hmm. How much time, what percentage of the time now would you say you spend in Kentucky versus LA? What sort of a break is it?
Yeah, it depends on the projects that are going. It depends on the time of the year. If I'm out pitching, on a show, I'm spending several weeks at a time in LA. My default position is just to be back in Kentucky because, like I said, I try to keep the little guy here with the family and all that. It's just a lot easier, truthfully. So it depends. I've got a TV property that's set up at A&E Studios right now that we're out to networks with. Hopefully we get some good news on that here in the coming days, and then suddenly we're out shooting pilot, hopefully. And so then you just got to be fluid. You got to be flexible, and that's tough. If you've got a regular 9 to 5 and things like that. So
It sounds like you take your 2-year-old and your wife back and forth with you on to LA and Kentucky.
If I'm out for a long period of time in LA, I will. If I'm out for a week of, whatever, for a couple of days of that, I mean, traveling with a 2-year-old's awful enough that it's an incentive to, keep him back here if he doesn't need to be. But if I'm ever out for a long stretch, we bring him out just to, for my own sanity. I like having him around. I don't want to spend, more than a couple weeks away from him if I don't have to.
Yeah, sure. So I always like to wrap up these interviews, just ask, how can people follow you and just kind of keep up with what you're doing. If you have a Twitter handle, you can mention that. If you're on Facebook, a blog, really whatever you feel comfortable sharing, I will put in the show notes and link to it. But you can just mention it here, and hopefully people can kind of follow along with what you're up to.
Yeah, for sure. I'm on Twitter more than anything else, and that's just at Tyler Hisel. It's Hisel. And yeah, I mean, it's, this, but Twitter is just such a spectacular format for writers of all kind of, levels to just, share resources and ask questions. I know I've been asked questions, and I've asked questions of those, who have gone before me. It's a great resource, and yeah, happy to hear from anybody or shine light on my bizarre journey in any way I can.
Perfect. So I'll link to that in the show notes. Well, Tyler, you've been very generous with your time. This has been a great interview. I've enjoyed talking to you. I did watch the movie a couple nights ago. Very interesting film. I really enjoyed it. Very entertaining. So I wish you luck with it.
I appreciate it. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you. We'll talk to you later.
Sounds good.
I just want to mention 2 things we're doing at Selling Your Screenplay to help screenwriters find producers who are looking for material. First, we've created a monthly newsletter that will be sent directly to producers. Every member of SYS Select can submit 1 log line per newsletter. I went and emailed my large database of producers and asked them if they would like to receive this monthly newsletter of pitches. So far, we have about 160 producers who have signed up to receive it. These producers are hungry for material and happy to read scripts from new writers. So if you want to participate in this pitch newsletter, get your script into the hands of a lot of producers, sign up at sellingyourscreenplay.com/select. And secondly, we've partnered with one of the premier paid screenwriting leads sites, so we can syndicate their premium paid screenwriting leads to SYS Select members. There are a lot of great paid leads coming in each week from our partner. Recently, we've been getting about 10 to 12 high-quality paid screenwriting jobs per week. These are producers and production companies who are actively looking to buy material or are looking to hire a screenwriter for a specific project. If you sign up for SYS Select, you'll get these leads emailed directly to you several times per week. These leads run the gamut from production companies looking for a specific type of spec script to producers looking to hire a screenwriter to write up one of their ideas. We have producers looking for shorts, producers looking for features, producers looking for TV and web series pilots. It's a huge array of different types of projects that these producers are looking for. And these leads are exclusive to our partner and SYS Select members. To sign up, just go to sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. Again, sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. In the next episode of the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Jessup. She was actually on the podcast about 18 months ago. Since then, she's written a book, and I have her back on. We talk about a book, and we also go through a variety of career strategies for screenwriters at various stages of their careers. She actually works with screenwriters in all levels of their careers, and I thought it would be interesting just to ask her, hey, what's some good advice for beginning screenwriters? What's some beginning advice for, intermediate screenwriters who maybe have an agent but haven't quite sold something, and all the way up the ladder to working TV writers, working studio writers, just what's some advice for them. So we kind of go through that. And as I said, she wrote this book, which is a really interesting nuts and bolts account of the screenwriting industry. It's really unlike anything I've ever read, just a lot of just sort of business stuff about screenwriting. So we talk about that, we dig into that. And then, as I said, we go through some of the various stages of screenwriting careers and what they can do to get their careers to the next level. So keep an eye out for that episode next week. To wrap things up, I just want to touch on a few things from today's interview with Tyler. The thing that impressed me most about Tyler is his positive can-do attitude and his hustle. I kind of probed him a little bit about some of the downsides or just some of the, problems that he ran into. And he just always seemed to be very, very positive. He always had a positive spin on the situation. And there's really no underestimating how valuable this positive attitude is in this business. No matter who you are and how talented you are, there's going to be a lot of rejections and setbacks. And just listening to Tyler talk about how he was constantly pitching people onto scripts and networking, that's what it takes to really get ahead. So I think that's a great lesson for us. As he said, pitching people while working the desk at a production company is probably frowned upon, but sometimes that's what you got to do. You don't want to be weird about it. And I'm sure there were a lot of people he pitched who never responded, but you only need that one person. That's the great thing about this. You don't need to convince 10 people to option or to buy your script. You only need one or two people, and even if you get a million no's, you only need that one yes. And that's really part of the strategy. I also think, as I said, Tyler's personality is just very positive, friendly, outgoing. And I think that probably also really helped him in this, in just working the desk. They liked him. He was friendly. And as I said, he wasn't being weird about it. He probably made the pitch, and he talked to them in a way that didn't make them feel uncomfortable. And that's important as well, because you've got to learn to sell your stuff, and you've got to learn about how to talk to people and to, convince them to read your script, and not just hey, yes, I'll read it just to get me off the phone type of a thing. They've got to genuinely be interested in the story and interested in him as a person to take the time to actually read the script. Anyway, though, it's another story of someone working from a low-level job in the business and just looking for their big break and then making things happen for themselves when opportunity arrives. I've talked about this numerous times on the podcast. I definitely think this is probably the number one way screenwriters eventually make it as screenwriters. Listen to his story. That's the very typical story. And I know it's not necessarily going to work for everyone. I mentioned this on the podcast before too. I did a nice little post a couple of months ago where I went through all of my podcast interviews and kind of tallied up how people broke into the industry. I will link to that in the show notes again, but I think Tyler, and the number one way was basically what Tyler just described here. You start out as a low-level job, you slowly work your way up. That seems to be like the most common. If you just had to figure out what are the best chances you have of becoming a screenwriter, that's definitely far and above the most common way. When you talk to successful screenwriters that actually sold stuff, that's going to be, and I think it was probably even more than 50%. That was definitely the single largest way screenwriters broke in. More than cold query letters, more than contests, more than Inktip or Blacklist or any of these other channels. It was really just working in the industry and making connections, making contacts, writing, and getting your stuff out there. And that's one trap I've seen people fall into, and it's something you really want to be careful of. I see people take low-level jobs in the industry and they don't continue to write. Listen to what Tyler said. He was writing on the weekends. He was writing at night. And that's so, so important. You don't necessarily want one of these jobs if it just completely drains you and you have no energy to write at night and write on the weekends. And it's understandable. A lot of these jobs are, especially these low-level jobs, they're incredibly low-paying and they're incredibly grueling. When I first got to Hollywood, I had one of these PA jobs, and it was literally, it's like you show up at 7 in the morning. You're lucky if you're done 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night. And they were literally paying me. And again, this was a number of years ago, but I bet these jobs are still out there. They were literally paying me $50 a day for 10, 12 hours. And needless to say, that wasn't enough money to even live on. And so I was teaching tennis on the weekends, and their production was ramping up. This was actually, I take it back, their release was actually ramping up. I was doing some basically just production assistant work for them. They were getting ready to release their money. They had already shot their movie by the time I came on, and they were getting ready to release it. So they were gearing up, and it was a kind of a do-it-yourself release, and that was taking a lot of time. But anyways, I was teaching tennis on the weekends because this $50 a day wasn't enough to live on. And they wanted me to come in and work on the weekends. And I said, I can't. I've got this other job. And they actually ended up firing me because I couldn't come in on the weekends. But that's another story. But the thing is, when I was doing this job, truthfully, it was just too hard to go home and write. So you've got to keep some kind of a balance. It's just not going to work working 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, plus some weekends. Obviously, you're not going to have time to write. So you want to keep some perspective on things, and all the connections in the world are not going to be worth diddly squat if you don't actually have some decent scripts to show those people. So keep that in mind. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening.